On December 3, 1957, the first snow fell in the small town of Sycamore, Illinois. Two small girls asked their parents to let them go play outside on their own, even though it was already dark. Their names were Kathy Sigmund and Maria Ridulph, and they were only 8 and 7 years old. They had been looking forward to their first snow and had spent the day cutting out paper snowflakes. The girls met in the street and started playing, running around, hiding from the headlights of passing cars. At some point, a young man came up to them and asked them if they liked playing with dolls. After this exchange, only one of the girls would return home. The disappearance of Maria Ridulph would upend the life of the small town and shock the whole of America. Maria Elizabeth Ridulph was born on March 12, 1957 in Sycamore, Illinois, to homemaker Frances Ridulph and factory worker Michael Ridulph. Maria's father earned $80 a week, which was pretty good money for the time, translating into about $850 into today's money. Maria was the youngest child in the family. She had 2 older sisters and a brother. Her parents were very religious and raised their children accordingly, so Maria never missed a class at Sunday school. At the time of her disappearance, Maria was in 2nd grade at West Elementary School, where she was also considered a diligent student. She got good grades and made friends with other children. All the teachers loved her. She had big, expressive eyes and a loud laugh. Her best friend was her neighbor Kathy, who was a year older than her. The girls went to school together every morning and also spent time together afterwards. At the time, Sycamore was a tiny town of only 7,000 inhabitants. Everybody knew each other and oftentimes didn't even bother to lock the doors for the night. The worst thing that had happened in Sycamore at that point was that somebody had been writing obscenities in chalk on the road next to the houses of Maria and Kathy. This, and not robberies or armed assault, was considered the main problem in town, and it's important to keep this in mind because it seemed that nothing bad could happen in a town where something so harmless was already a serious offense. In December of 1957, Maria was 7 years old. She was small for her age, 44 inches tall, and with a weight of 53 pounds. However, she was far from being a timid wallflower. She could be loud, was easily scared, and would immediately start screaming if she became worried. Most of all, she was scared of the dark, sometimes even to the point of crying. That December morning, Maria and Kathy went to school as usual. Their parents easily let them go alone since the city was very calm. The girls always stayed together, never changed their usual routes, and furthermore, Maria's brother Chuck would watch over his sister and her friend on their way to school. After school, the girls went to Maria's house to make paper snowflakes. Winter was approaching, and with it, the Christmas season and school vacation. At 4:15 p.m. on the same day, 2 other girls saw an odd man staring at them in the center of town. They became scared and hid in a restaurant. When they went back out, the stranger had vanished, but left a present: photographs of naked women scattered on the street. Now, let's get back to Maria and Kathy. The girls decided to go play outside after dinner, hoping to finally see the first snow. They played next to the place obscenities had been found written on the road, at the intersection of Archie Place and Center Cross. The spot was made attractive to children by a huge tree that grew there. At 5 p.m., Kathy went home while Maria's family gathered around the table for dinner. That evening, they had rabbit with carrots and potatoes and a glass of milk. Maria didn't have much of an appetite. She ate some rabbit, drank her milk, but didn't touch her vegetables, excitedly looking through the window where the first snow had started to swirl. She called Kathy.
"I can go outside tonight. Can you?"
Kathy's parents let her go play with her friend. Kathy lived in a white house at the end of the street. Her family was the first in the neighborhood to own an electric clothes dryer, and Kathy had put on jeans that were still warm, fresh out of the dryer. Kathy and Maria met up mid-street and ran to the massive tree where they played duck the cars. As soon as they saw the headlights of oncoming vehicles, they would hide to try to avoid them. After a while, a stranger approached them. He was a young man with light-colored hair, big teeth with a gap, and a high, thin voice. The girls had never seen him before. "Hello, little girls," said the stranger. "Are you having fun here?" He introduced himself as Johnny and asked if the girls wanted piggyback rides. He also casually told the girls that he was 24 years old and unmarried. "Do you like dolls?" Johnny asked. The girls smiled and nodded in agreement. Kathy declined the piggyback ride, whereas Maria accepted the stranger's offer with delight. She loved getting piggyback rides from adults and giggled loudly as Johnny set her up on his shoulders. After the first ride, Maria ran home to fetch a doll that she wanted to show her new acquaintance, while Kathy stayed alone with Johnny on the dark sidewalk. The stranger, his face occasionally lit up by passing headlights, asked Kathy casually if she wanted to walk around some other streets or get a car or bus ride. Kathy carefully stepped back and said she did not. Then Johnny told her she was pretty. Kathy thought to herself that he seemed to like Maria a lot more. She noticed how he was looking at her friend. His stare gave Kathy a chill. Meanwhile, Maria popped back home. Her father was watching TV and her mother was reading a newspaper. Maria had wanted to take her favorite prettiest doll outside, but Frances suggested she take an older rubber doll with her. After several minutes, Maria joined Kathy and Johnny. Kathy had grown a bit cold and decided to run home to fetch warm mittens. She asked her friend to come with her, but Maria declined, instead staying with the stranger on the street. When Kathy returned a few minutes later with her mittens, both Maria and Johnny were gone.
"Maria! Maria!"
Kathy cried again and again, running up and down Archie Place. Nobody answered. Kathy rushed to the house of Maria's parents. At the door, she bumped into Maria's brother Chuck, who was 11 years old at the time.
"Maria's lost. I can't find Maria,"
the girl said worriedly. Chuck and his friend Randy ran out onto the street to look for Maria and went down all the way to school. On the way, they noticed a police car go by. Later, they would say they should have stopped it, but at the time, neither Chuck nor his friend had yet realized something awful had happened. Meanwhile, Kathy had already told her mother Flora about Johnny. Flora immediately called Maria's mother. Her father wanted to wait a bit longer before calling the police. The previous year, Maria had already disappeared once, wandering off to play at a cemetery without telling anybody. She returned just as the neighbors began organizing a search. Frances, unlike her husband, decided not to wait and drove to the police. The time was 8:10 p.m. Chuck, Maria's brother, continued wandering through the surrounding neighborhoods in search for his sister. He was not particularly committed to the job, thinking Maria would soon turn up on her own. But then, next to the neighbor's garage, he saw Maria's doll that she had taken outside with her. A search was launched that same evening. Policemen knocked on neighbors' doors, volunteers scurried around town. One of the doors that they knocked on was that of Ralph and Eileen Tassier. Ralph was the owner of the local hardware store, and the volunteers needed flashlights for their search. The man quickly opened up his store and gave them what they needed. The Tassiers lived not far from Maria's house, but were not acquainted with her family. Ralph and Eileen had 7 children: Catherine, Jean, Mary Pat, Bob, Janet, Nancy, and John. They were a rather poor family. The eldest sibling, the 17-year-old John, was born in Ireland and was Eileen's son from her previous marriage. His father had died in World War II, and it was John who wasn't at home that ill-fated December evening. The Tassier girls knew that John was their mother's favorite, even though he would often get into different scrapes. For instance, he was expelled from school for shoving and insulting a teacher, but even for that, his mother didn't scold him. There was, however, something eerie and dark about him. That evening, their father Ralph joined other townsmen in the search for Maria, while Eileen helped the town's women in making coffee and sandwiches for the search groups. The next day after Maria's disappearance, the newspapers were filled with headlines about her kidnapping. The numerous articles included a description of Maria as well as of her kidnapper, who was wearing a bright sweater with blue, yellow, and green stripes. Already then, it wasn't clear when exactly it was that Maria went missing. According to some sources, it happened at 6 p.m., according to others, at 7 p.m. The search continued. The whole town was worried about the small girl's fate, but there was no news. The day turned to night. Maria's parents pleaded with the kidnapper, hoping he would return their beloved daughter. She also pleaded with Maria, asking her not to cry and not to make a fuss, promising they would be together soon. Frances knew her daughter. For somebody to be able to take her, he would have to earn her trust, otherwise she would have screamed and attracted the neighbors' attention. Maria's father, Michael, was angry at the reporters for considering the most tragic version of events. "Quit saying she's dead. I know she is alive. Nobody would have any reason to kill her. I want fathers to help look for my little girl." Chuck Ridulph, Maria's 11-year-old brother, continued actively participating in the search. The police checked car trunks and cellar doors while volunteers patrolled the town and its surroundings, many of them even carrying guns. Various aircraft circled the sky. Every house in the town was searched. The FBI joined the search, worried that Maria might have been taken out of Illinois. President Dwight Eisenhower himself regularly checked in on the case. So far, however, the police had only found a bag of abandoned kittens and a torn, bloodied petticoat. There was no sign of Maria. Several times, the investigators showed Kathy mugshots of ex-criminals, but she didn't recognize Johnny in any of them. In the end, the young girl became confused. Kathy found herself under police guard in case Johnny decided to come after her too. Kathy's mother told her,
"Remember his face, Kathy. You have to remember his face, because you are the only one who can catch him. You are the only one who knows what he looks like."
More time passed, but there was still no ransom note, no phone call from the kidnapper. The police realized that the culprit's motive was not money, but a perverted interest in the young girl. The police chief believed the kidnapper came from outside of town. None of the locals would have been capable of something like that, he said. Meanwhile, the search continued. Investigators had even drained a lake and set off an explosion in the local quarry to find traces of Maria, but to no avail. 3 days after Maria disappeared, a woman called the police and told them of a young man by the name of Trashner who lived next door and fit the kidnapper's description. There were no families with that name in town, but there were the Tessiers. On December 8th, several FBI agents paid them a visit. The Tessiers acknowledged that their son John indeed fit the suspect's description, but insisted that on the day of the kidnapping he had been in Rockford, 40 miles away from Sycamore, where he wanted to enlist in the army. Phone records confirmed this. Someone indeed called the Tessiers' Sycamore residence from Rockford at 7 p.m. that day. The Tessiers claimed it was their son who called to ask his stepfather to pick him up from Rockford. The problem was that earlier Eileen had claimed that her son was at home that evening. Her daughters knew that their older brother wasn't at home that night, but the police didn't question them, preferring to talk only to grown-ups. A week after Maria's disappearance, the police told volunteers to look for large flocks of carrion birds in the fields. They didn't hope to find Maria alive anymore, whereas birds could point to where her body was. All the talk among Sycamore locals was about the missing girl. The search continued. The phones at the precinct never stopped ringing. Even the smallest lead could be of use. The most important source of information was Kathy, who had the time to get a good look at the kidnapper. She made an effort to remember each detail. The police described her as the most completely mature little girl they had ever seen. The holiday season came. Maria's parents placed her gifts under the Christmas tree. What if she would return that day and wish to unpack them? Among the presents was a typewriter, Maria's dream. Unfortunately, there was no Christmas miracle. A month passed, and then another. A reminder of the tragedy, the giant tree where the girls had played that day was cut down. Spring arrived. On April 26, 1958, A man was hunting for mushrooms when he saw something strange under a fallen tree next to a farm on the border to Iowa. I thought it was an old deer hide. I came up to it then and I could see some bones and I thought somebody had shot a dog. Then I looked closer and it looked like human bones. I noticed the jacket, but I didn't pay any attention to it until I noticed the skull. I started to look further and I noticed the hair, and I saw then that it was a little girl. Animals and birds had already nearly turned her corpse into a skeleton. The forager returned to the car where his wife was waiting for him, and they called the police from the closest farmhouse. It was Maria, found 120 miles from her home. The police arrived on the scene but didn't take any pictures. The 28-year-old rookie coroner decided that would be for the best because he didn't want the photos to appear in all the newspapers. Experts were unable to determine the cause of death, beyond the fact that it was connected to violence. Maria's mother, Frances, touched the black and white checkered shirt that the corpse was clad in and recognized that it was her little girl. Dental records made the identification official. Maria was buried on a warm spring day in a small white casket. Over 300 people arrived to say farewell, including Kathy, who was there under police guard, wearing a brand new coat. The 7-year-old Maria was remembered as an intelligent, fun-loving girl with perfect Sunday school attendance. This little girl has entered into everlasting peace probably on the night she was taken. Maria was taken out of life through unusual circumstances, but nothing could deprive her of God-given salvation, said Reverend Louis Going, pastor at the Evangelical Lutheran Church of St. John. The hymn "Jesus Loves Me" was played. It was Maria's favorite. The hope that her killer would be found became dimmer with every day. Decades later, the tragedy will become known as Sycamore's 9/11, in reference to another catastrophe that changed the world forever. Of course, the town changed. The people changed. Kathy's childhood ended the evening that Maria was taken.
It robbed me of my childhood. I was labeled. I was the girl who was with Maria. A lot of parents wouldn't let their girls play with me. They were afraid he'd come back and take their child. I couldn't wait to get out of Sycamore. It bothered me my whole life why he took her and not me. For years, I would ask myself, was she prettier than I was?
Such questions point to the fact that Kathy was suffering from what's known as survivor's guilt syndrome. The incident has traumatized her deeply. Later, she moved away from Sycamore and married a man named Mark Chapman. His mother had tried to talk him out of this relationship, but the young man was unrelenting. It didn't matter to him that Kathy was known to everyone as the one who was with Maria. The couple settled in Florida, raised 3 children, and later moved back to Illinois. Even though Kathy had moved, she was always thinking about the incident. Johnny was out there somewhere, free to come after her at any moment. Kathy, however, wasn't the only one to leave Sycamore as soon as such an opportunity presented itself. John Tessier, the man who resembled Johnny's description, left town on December 11, 1957, 8 days after the disappearance of Maria Ridulph. Years later, John would say he didn't often think about what happened to the girl, but that he never forgot her. He claims he only talked to her once. She was walking along the street not far from home. He was 13 years old, she was only 3. Now, let's delve into John's biography. Maybe we will find some hints there. John Tessier moved to Sycamore during his childhood and from a very young age dreamed of going into the military. His parents had met each other in London during World War II. John spent his youngest years with his grandparents not far from London. The city itself wasn't safe, and his parents were often away because of military service. John hardly remembered his father. After John's father died in the war, his mother found herself a new husband in America, and they soon sailed to the United States. John continued taking an interest in the military, often wore camouflage pants for which the other children nicknamed him Commando. He loved listening to military songs, and after school, or rather after being expelled from school, he joined the army. At home, his family called him Johnny, just like that kidnapper. After Maria disappeared, Johnny became a suspect. His alibi that he was allegedly 40 miles away from town wasn't particularly ironclad. Indeed, at 7 p.m., someone called the Tessier household from Rockford and introduced themselves as John Tessier to the operator. Yes, in those days, you still had to make calls through a phone operator. However, nobody knew the exact time of Maria's disappearance. If she was indeed kidnapped at 7 p.m., then John Tessier had a watertight alibi. But if she was kidnapped earlier, say at 6 p.m., the alibi was no longer valid, since driving 40 miles in an hour is not difficult at all. We know for a fact that between 7:15 and 7:30 p.m., John was indeed at the military recruiting station in Rockford. At least 2 recruiters saw him and talked to him. One of them thought John was behaving oddly, as if under the influence of drugs. The other one described John as a lost sheep. A third recruiter talked to Johnny on December 4th. He recalled that the young man had a cut on his lip and told him it was a good thing he was not in Sycamore the previous day because of the disappearance of the girl. Tessier also told him that he'd never be considered a suspect because his girlfriend's father was a deputy sheriff. All this seemed a bit suspicious. The FBI questioned John on December 8th, and 2 days later he underwent a lie detector test. Interestingly enough, he admitted that he had had sexual relations with a younger girl, but said that this had happened a long time ago. Although these odd details didn't exactly bring out the best in John, there wasn't any actual evidence of his involvement. There was one witness who had seen John's Pontiac with flames painted on the sides on a street in Sycamore on December 3rd. He hadn't seen who was behind the wheel, but knew for a fact that John would never let anyone else drive his car. John's mother was very worried for her son. Nonetheless, she and her husband Ralph claimed with confidence that Ralph had picked John up from Rockford. Only years later would his half-sister Catherine say she wasn't sure about such a timeline. Perhaps her father had actually picked John up a bit later. As for the lie detector test, John passed it easily. The examiners concluded that he was not hiding any guilty knowledge pertaining to the case. Tessier was crossed off the suspects list and got enlisted in the military. First, he served in Vietnam, then upon returning to the States, started working in the police. It seemed he mostly used the perks of the job to flirt with women, exaggeratedly bragging about his achievements. He cheated on his second wife, which was why the two broke up. It was around this time that he got fired from the police. His behavior had long since annoyed his chief. He would tell dirty jokes during lunch break, and often began affairs with women who had been involved with the police. His colleagues weren't fond of him either. The last straw was his assault of a 15-year-old girl. Michelle Weinman had run away from her abusive father and met good policeman John on the street. He earned her trust and let her stay at his place, sleeping in his living room. Interestingly, there was another young woman living with her at Tessier's place, but John was more interested in Michelle. One night he assaulted and raped her. Michelle went to the police, but they didn't believe her.
They were really mean to me. They scared me so bad. I didn't know how to tell them what had happened. So they started yelling at me. This one particular guy started yelling at me and telling me I was nothing but a tramp, telling me he was going to make it look like I wanted it, that I begged for it, that they were going to make my life hell, that they were going to drag me through the mud.
John would be charged with statutory rape, but in the end was convicted only for communication with a minor for immoral purposes and placed on probation without receiving a prison sentence. After leaving the police, John Tessier decided to become a photographer, but it wasn't particularly successful. This was, however, how he met his next wife, Denise Traxler. He would later recall 2 disturbing incidents. Once, she saw him eating a banana while demonstratively rolling his eyes and opening his mouth wide in front of his 12-year-old daughter from his previous marriage, who was staying with them for a short while. Later, she found a nude picture of his daughter hidden in his desk. Of course, none of these things prove Tessier's involvement in the disappearance of Maria Ridulph, but you have to agree that it all sounds very suspicious. And it is made even eerier by the words that John's mother, Eileen Tessier, said to her daughter Janet on her deathbed many years later.
Those 2 little girls, and the one that disappeared. John did it. John did it, and you have to tell someone.
Janet was very young when Maria was kidnapped, but recalls how the town changed after the incident. At the same time, Janet, like her other sisters, knew that her mother would always take John's side. But would she have actually covered up his crime for him? Eileen died on January 23, 1994. 300 people attended her funeral, but curiously, John wasn't among them. His siblings said that they didn't want to see him there. Janet was afraid of her half-brother. At some point, he had even threatened her with a gun. After hearing her mother's confession, Janet decided to call the police, but was told to leave the old case alone. She then called the FBI, but they also didn't help her, referring her back to the Sycamore Police Department. Janet continued her investigation nonetheless. At one point, she wrote the following email to the Illinois State Police.
Sycamore, Illinois, December 1957. A 7-year-old child named Maria Ridulph vanished. Her remains were found in another county several miles away in early spring of 1958. I still believe that John Samuel Tessier from Sycamore, Illinois, aka Jack Daniel McCullough, was and is responsible for her death. He's living in the Seattle-Tacoma, Washington area under the name Jack Daniel McCullough. I've given information to the person responsible for the cold case in Sycamore. I've done this a few times. Nothing is ever done. This is the last time I mention this to anyone. What information I do have makes Tessier/McCullough a viable suspect and worth looking into. I'm not going to keep doing this over and over. It's exhausting, and it dredges up painful, horrible memories.
John Tessier had by that time indeed changed his name to Jack McCullough in honor of his mother. As for Janet, her letter was finally answered. Detectives Larry Codd and Brian Hanley reopened the cold case. They began working with the Tessier siblings. Janet told them of her mother's confession, while Jean admitted that John had sexually assaulted her when she was 14 years old. He would also molest other girls, forcing Jean to stand watch as he did so. The detectives decided to check John's alibi yet another time. They found his old high school friends who said that he was supposed to pick them up at a shop that night but didn't show up. Years earlier, John had claimed to have helped in the search for Maria with a classmate and even found some dirty magazines and turned them over to police. And he said that he was never with John that night and hadn't found any magazines, dirty or otherwise. As you may recall, Johnny had given Maria piggyback rides. Another girl from the neighborhood, Pamela, recounted that he had given her piggyback rides as well. She knew him, and like many other kids in the area, thought he was a bit weird. The evening that Maria disappeared, Pamela's father said about John, "He'd better have a damn good alibi." The main question of the investigation remained, when exactly was Maria kidnapped? The police consulted the testimony of the girl's mother, as well as reports of a worker and a bus driver who had gone past the spot where Maria had disappeared. According to their statements, she was kidnapped no later than 6:20 p.m. because they saw no children in the street afterwards. If the whole thing had indeed happened before 6:20 p.m., then John could have easily made it to Rockford with Maria and called his parents from there. John's girlfriend, Jan Edwards, told the police soon after Maria's disappearance that she had met John that night at around 9 p.m. During the new investigation, however, she admitted to the cops that she never saw him that evening. Jan also provided the police with a 1957 photo of John. Inside the frame of the photograph, detectives also found a one-way ticket for a train from Rockford to Chicago that John had allegedly boarded to travel to his induction physical. The ticket was unused. Kathy Sigmund had not been shown Tessier's picture before because the police simply didn't have one, but now they finally did. They showed the photo to Kathy, who was now a middle-aged woman, but who still held on to the promise she gave to her mother to remember Johnny's face. Kathy was shown a lineup of 6 photographs. She studied them and soon pointed to one. It was John Tessier. The investigators asked if she was sure of her choice. She answered yes, claiming she had remembered Johnny's face forever. Emboldened, the police started planning further steps. They had to talk to Johnny and to the people who knew him. They talked to his ex-wives and found out a blood-curdling fact. John's daughter had disappeared at the age of 34. Her body would be found on a golf course in 2013. Her middle name was Mary. By the time the police came to him, John Tessier had turned into a mellow family man who had been married to one woman for 20 years. Sue, his wife, later recalled that John hardly spoke of his family and didn't keep in touch with his sisters. She also revealed that before the wedding, she got a call from one of John's sisters who told Sue she shouldn't marry him because he was an evil person. On June 29, 2011, John Tessier, or rather Jack McCullough, was arrested and taken in for interrogation. "Let me tell you something. I did not kidnap that little girl. Look at my eyes. I did not have anything to do with that little girl. She was loved in the neighborhood. She was a little Mexican girl with big brown eyes, and she was sweet as could be, hardly said a word to anybody, and everyone loved her." John grew annoyed and evasive when answering the detective's questions. When asked about him sexually assaulting his sister, he denied the allegation and claimed that they were just playing around. He spoke of Maria with great tenderness, however, saying she was lovely, 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 and looked like a little Barbie doll. He didn't believe his mother's confession. "She loved me," John insisted. John couldn't explain the unused train ticket, and when he was shown the old photograph, said it was of poor quality and that he couldn't recognize himself. His situation was getting more and more precarious. On July 27, 2011, John Tessier was brought to Sycamore in handcuffs. On the same day, Maria Ridulph's body was exhumed. It's a spine-chilling thought that at this point, John was already an old man, while Maria had forever remained a 7-year-old girl. Her white coffin was brought to the precinct, where both the forensics office and the cell that John was placed in were located. Forensic anthropologist Crystal Latham was able to determine the cause of death. She found cuts on Maria's neck bones and concluded that she had been stabbed in the throat several times. No traces of DNA were found on Maria's body. Now, John Tessier faced 2 trials, one on Maria's case and the other on the abuse suffered by his sister. During trial, Kathy Sigmund encountered Johnny. She stared at him, unable to look away. Janet Tessier once again recounted the confession made by her mother. However, another sister of hers who was in the room at the time pointed out that she only heard her mother say he did it. She didn't make out who did what. Several police informants testified in court that John had confessed to murdering Mary in a conversation with a fellow inmate. Both informants, however, said that he had strangled her, so where did the traces of a blade on Maria's vertebrae come from? According to this testimony, John killed her almost by accident. She had fallen during a piggyback ride in his home, and he was trying to keep her quiet and accidentally suffocated her. Both informants, however, were jailhouse snitches with suspect credibility and long prison sentences. Perhaps they were expecting a reduction in exchange for information. One detail, however, was noticed not only by the snitches, but by the detectives as well. When talking about Maria, John became transformed. His eyes would begin twinkling and his gaze would become dreamy and giddy. Having weighed all the evidence, the court found John guilty and sentenced him to life in prison. In jail, John had a hard time. He had killed a child, and what was even worse by prison rules was a former cop. John continued claiming his innocence, and his wife Sue believed him. Several other family members also supported him, saying that too many facts didn't add up. It would seem that the case could finally be closed. The culprit was caught and put in jail. Maria's and Kathy's families had their questions answered, but this wasn't the end. 4 years after the trial, the town of Sycamore was shaken by the news. John Tessier was in fact innocent. How could this be? In 2015, John, aka Jack, was given another chance to present evidence and an alibi. His case was based on the phone call that he made from Rockford at around 7 p.m. Phone records confirming this were discovered. He had indeed called his mother from a Rockford payphone. The weather report for the area showed that it had been frosty, and the roads became slippery, making it impossible to drive the 40 miles to Rockford in under an hour. This evidence was admitted in court, and in 2016, John, aka Jack, was released from prison. The Maria Ridulph case was still unsolved. But who did it then, and could Kathy have really pointed to an innocent man? Let's have a look at the other suspects in this case. In 1997, Sycamore Police Lieutenant Patrick Solar claimed to have solved the Maria Ridulph murder. His chief suspect was a man named William Henry Redmond, who had worked at fairs and amusement parks and had quite a record of crimes against children. Redmond, however, had died in 1992, 5 years before Solar made the accusation. In 2016, already after John was released from prison, the police received another letter that allegedly contains the name of another suspect. This name has not yet been made public, but we may find out more in the future. There was also another man named Johnny Hilburn who was in Sycamore on the day Maria disappeared. He claimed he was lost and had asked two small girls playing at the intersection of Center Cross Street and Archie Place, which was where Maria and Kathy had been, about how to get to Rockford. In 1958, it became known that he had sexually abused his 5-year-old daughter. However, Kathy Sigmund did not recognize him when the investigators showed her his picture. Today, the Maria Ridulph murder is still considered unsolved, while John Tessier had sued the police and is waiting for damages to be paid. Many questions still remain unanswered. Could John indeed have reached Rockford so quickly? At what time did Maria really disappear? Was Kathy indeed unable to remember Johnny's face? Should we believe the confession of a mother on her deathbed? And the most important question, who really kidnapped Maria Ridulph? And will this person ever be found? Let me know in the comments what you think about this story, and as always, stay safe.